I'm David Coleman, 42, and for 15 years I've worn the quiet pride of military service like an invisible uniform. Tonight, sitting around my brother-in-law's polished dining table, I watched familiar faces twist with condescension as they dismissed my dead-end career and wasted potential. My wife Sarah's silence cut deeper than their words, her embarrassment radiating across the mahogany surface like spilled wine. At least the kids will have better role models. My sister-in-law Janet smirked, gesturing toward her husband's latest promotion at the bank. The others nodded, their laughter sharp and knowing. But tomorrow, at my son's parent-teacher conference, something would happen that would shatter their assumptions forever. The truth about my service and the respect I'd earned in ways they couldn't imagine was about to surface in the most unexpected way. Some honors can't be measured in salary figures or corner offices. The silence in the car felt heavier than the humid night air pressing against the windows. Sarah stared out at the passing streetlights, her wedding ring catching the amber glow as she twisted it around her finger, habit I'd learned to recognize as her way of processing frustration. They weren't entirely wrong, you know, she said, finally, her voice carefully measured, about the opportunities you've missed. I kept my eyes on the road, hands steady on the steering wheel. 23 years of marriage had taught me when to speak and when to let her words find their own space. Janet's promotion put her at 6 figures this year. Robert's talking about the lake house again. She turned toward me, and I could feel her studying my profile. When was the last time we could even consider a real vacation? The question hung between us like an accusation. I thought about the envelope hidden in my desk drawer at home, the one containing our savings account statement, showing more than they'd ever imagine. Money I'd quietly accumulated through careful investments and the modest inheritance from my father. Money I'd never felt the need to flaunt. We do fine, I said simply. Fine, she repeated the word like it tasted bitter. David, I'm 41 years old. Sometimes I wonder what my life would have looked like if I'd made different choices. The admission hit harder than anything her family had said over dinner. I glanced at her reflection in the passenger window, still beautiful, still the woman who'd waited for me through 2 deployments, still the mother who'd raised our son with unwavering love. But somewhere along the way, she'd started measuring our life against other people's definitions of success. You mean if you'd married someone else, I said quietly. I mean if I'd married someone with ambition, someone who wanted more than just getting by. I pulled into our driveway, the familiar sight of our modest 2-story home suddenly feeling smaller through her eyes. The mortgage was paid off, had been for 3 years, but I'd never mentioned it. Some victories felt too private to share. Even with the woman I loved, I've never been about getting by. Sarah, I have been about being present. For you, for Jake. She was already gathering her purse, her movements sharp with unspoken resentment. Present doesn't pay for college tuition. Present doesn't secure our future. As she walked toward the house, I sat in the darkened car for a moment longer, remembering the woman who'd once told me that my steady presence was exactly what she needed. The woman who'd said she'd rather have a good man than a wealthy one. Tomorrow's parent-teacher conference felt like a mountain I'd have to climb alone. I found myself standing in the kitchen at 2 in the morning, staring at the refrigerator door, where a faded photograph still hung beneath a magnet shaped like the American flag. The picture showed 18 young men in dress blues, fresh out of boot camp, standing at attention with the kind of pride that only comes from surviving something that breaks you down and builds you back up. I was the third from the left, skinny kid from Ohio with more determination than sense, escaping a trailer park where my father's drinking had made every day feel like walking through a minefield. The military had been my lifeline, my chance to become something more than another statistic from a forgotten zip code. Boot camp at Paris Island had been everything the recruiters promised and nothing like I'd imagined. Drill Sergeant Martinez had a voice that could strip paint and a way of finding your deepest insecurities and forcing you to confront them. For 3 months, I learned that my body could endure more than my mind believed possible, that teamwork wasn't just a concept, but a matter of survival, and that serving something greater than yourself could give meaning to the darkest moments. The transformation wasn't just physical. Though the 100 push-ups before breakfast and the miles of running in combat boots had carved away the softness of civilian life, it was deeper than that, a fundamental shift in how I saw myself and my place in the world. For the first time in my life, I belonged somewhere. I mattered. The brotherhood forged in those barracks ran deeper than blood. We came from different backgrounds: farm boys from Iowa, city kids from Detroit, college dropouts, and high school stars whose plans had fallen apart. But we learned to move as one unit, to trust the man next to you with your life, to understand that individual glory meant nothing if the mission failed. I remembered the night before graduation, sitting on my bunk and writing a letter to my mother. I'd tried to explain how the scared kid who'd left home had become someone she might actually be proud of, someone who stood straighter, spoke with confidence, and had found his calling in service to his country. I'd promised her that her sacrifice, working double shifts to keep food on the table while Dad disappeared for days at a time, had not been in vain. The photograph captured that moment of pure possibility, when everything felt possible, and the future stretched ahead like an uncharted map. We thought we were invincible. We thought we understood what courage meant. We had no idea that real bravery would come later, in moments when split-second decisions would determine who went home and who didn't. Standing in my quiet kitchen, I traced my finger along the edge of that old photo. That young Marine couldn't. I have imagined he'd one day sit at a dinner table and be told his choices were failures. He couldn't have foreseen the weight of secrets he'd carry, or the loneliness of being misunderstood by the people he loved most, but he also couldn't have imagined the pride that would sustain him through the hardest moments, the knowledge that, when it mattered most, he'd answered the call. The classified mission file was still locked away somewhere in a Pentagon basement, stamped with clearance levels that most people would never see, but I could recall every detail as if it had happened yesterday rather than 15 years ago. October 15, 2009, Helmand Province, Afghanistan. Our forward operating base had received intelligence about a Taliban compound holding American contractors, who'd been captured 3 days earlier while surveying infrastructure for a civilian development project. The hostages included 2 engineers, a translator, and a medical volunteer, all civilians whose only crime had been trying to help rebuild a war-torn country. The official story, the one that made it into sanitized after-action reports, spoke of a successful joint operation resulting in the recovery of 4 American personnel. It mentioned nothing about the 2 hours we spent pinned down by sniper fire, or the IED that had taken out our primary extraction route, or the moment when everything went sideways and protocol became meaningless. I was part of a 12-man reconnaissance unit, trained for intelligence gathering and precision strikes. We were supposed to provide overwatch while Delta Force handled the actual rescue, but when their Black Hawk took RPG fire and went down 2 clicks from the target, suddenly our support mission became a race against time. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez looked at me across the rocky outcropping where we'd taken cover. "Coleman, you know that compound better than anyone. After 3 days of surveillance, what's our play?" The rational choice was to wait for backup, to follow protocol and let someone higher up the chain make the hard decisions. But those contractors had been moved twice already, and intelligence suggested they'd be executed at dawn as a message to other Western aid workers. We had maybe 4 hours before they disappeared forever into the mountains. "There's a drainage tunnel that runs under the north wall," I said, studying the terrain through my scope. "If we can create a diversion on the south side, 2 men could breach from below." What followed was the longest night of my life. We divided into 3 teams. Rodriguez led the diversion, Martinez provided sniper support, and I went underground with Corporal Jenkins to attempt the impossible. The tunnel was barely wide enough for our gear, filled with stagnant water and the kind of darkness that swallows sound. When we emerged inside the compound, we found the hostages in worse condition than expected. The medical volunteer, Dr. Sarah Chen, had a badly infected gunshot wound from the initial capture. One of the engineers was unconscious from dehydration. They couldn't walk, couldn't run, could barely whisper their names when we identified ourselves. The extraction became a nightmare of carrying dead weight while dodging Taliban fighters who seemed to appear from every shadow. Jenkins took a bullet in the shoulder during the first 100 yards. I ended up carrying Dr. Chen while coordinating with our Overwatch team, using hand signals and suppressed weapons to clear a path through chaos. The moment that still haunted my dreams came when we reached the outer perimeter. A teenage fighter, maybe 16 years old, rounded a corner with an AK-47 and the kind of desperate look that meant he'd rather die than let us escape. For a split second, we stared at each other across 20 feet of Afghan dust and rubble. He was someone's son, maybe someone's brother. But Dr. Chen was bleeding out against my chest, and 3 other Americans were counting on me to get them home. The choice was instantaneous and irrevocable. By the time backup arrived, we'd reached the emergency landing zone with all 4 hostages alive. Dr. Chen spent 6 weeks in a German hospital but made a full recovery. The engineers returned to their families. The translator was granted asylum and eventually became an American citizen. The official commendation spoke of exceptional courage under fire and devotion to duty beyond the call of service. But awards and citations couldn't capture the weight of that night, or the knowledge that sometimes doing the right thing requires carrying pieces of darkness you could never fully set down. That mission file contained the real story, the one that explained why I had been quietly transferred to intelligence work, why certain people in certain places knew my name, and why I had eventually been recruited for operations that didn't officially exist. It was also why I came home different, why I sometimes woke up in cold sweats, and why I'd never been able to explain to Sarah that the boring desk job she resented had actually been the natural progression of a career built on moments when ordinary people chose to do extraordinary things. The discharge papers felt strange in my hands, official documents that somehow failed to capture the weight of 15 years in service, honorable discharge, commendable record, eligible for all veteran benefits. The language was clinical, bureaucratic, missing the poetry of transformation that military service actually represented. Coming home in 2012 felt like stepping into a world that had continued spinning without me. The shopping malls seemed too bright, the conversations too trivial, the pace of civilian life oddly frantic and purposeless at the same time. I'd spent so many years where every day carried the possibility of life or death decisions that ordinary concerns, traffic jams, restaurant wait times, workplace drama felt surreal. The transition counselors had warned us about this. They'd used terms like adjustment period and reintegration challenges, but they couldn't prepare you for the loneliness of being surrounded by people who'd never understand the weight you carried. How do you explain to someone that you'd held dying men in your arms, that you'd made split-second decisions that saved lives, that you'd seen both the worst and best of humanity condensed into moments of absolute clarity? I found work as a security coordinator for a mid-sized logistics company, position that utilized my clearance and experience while offering the stability that civilian life required. The pay was decent, the benefits solid, the work undemanding by the standards of what I'd been doing overseas. But every day felt like wearing clothes that didn't quite fit. It was at a Veterans Day barbecue hosted by my new employer that I first saw Sarah. She was there with her friend Lisa, whose husband worked in accounting, and she had the kind of smile that seemed to illuminate everything around her. When Lisa introduced us, Sarah's handshake was firm and her eye contact direct. "Thank you for your service," she said, and unlike the automatic responses I'd grown accustomed to, she seemed to actually mean it. We talked for 3 hours that day. She was finishing her degree in elementary education, working part-time at a daycare center, and had the rare gift of asking questions that showed genuine interest rather than polite obligation. She wanted to know about the places I'd been, the people I'd met, the experiences that had shaped me. Not the classified details, but the human elements, what it felt like to be so far from home, how military friendships compared to civilian ones. What I missed most about service, more importantly, she listened to the answers. Our courtship was careful and deliberate. I'd seen too many military marriages fail to rush into anything, and Sarah had her own reasons for caution, a previous relationship that had ended badly, concerns about the emotional availability of men who'd spent years in combat zones, but there was something between us that felt both comfortable and electric, a connection that seemed to deepen with every conversation. She loved my steadiness, the way I approached problems methodically and kept my word absolutely. I loved her warmth, her ability to find humor in everyday situations, and the way she made me feel like I could build a life worth living. When I finally told her I loved her, 6 months after that first barbecue, she cried happy tears and said she'd been hoping I'd realize it too. Our wedding was small but perfect. Immediate family, close friends, and a handful of my military brothers who'd made the trip. Sarah looked radiant in her grandmother's dress, and when we exchanged vows, I felt like I was finally home, in a way that had nothing to do with geography. The early years of marriage were everything I'd hoped for. Sarah finished her degree and found a teaching position at a local elementary school. I was promoted twice and began taking night classes toward a business degree. We bought our first house, a modest 3-bedroom, in a neighborhood with good schools and friendly neighbors. Life felt purposeful and stable in ways I'd never experienced. But even then, there were moments when I could see Sarah measuring our life against some invisible standard. Comments from her more successful friends would leave her quiet and thoughtful. Stories about exotic vacations or expensive purchases would spark conversations about our long-term goals and financial planning. I began to realize that while she loved the man I'd become, she didn't fully understand the experiences that had shaped me. The classified nature of much of my service meant there were stories I couldn't tell, moments of pride I couldn't share, sacrifices that had to remain private. She saw only the surface, the steady paycheck, the regular hours, the comfortable but unspectacular life we were building together. The distance between who I really was and who she thought I was began as a hairline crack. But over the years, as her frustration grew and my silence deepened, that crack widened into something that threatened the foundation of everything we'd built. The first photo of Jake, taken moments after his birth, still sat framed on my night's tiny, wrinkled face with eyes squeezed shut against the harsh hospital lights. In that picture, Sarah looked exhausted but radiant, her hair damp with sweat and her smile brighter than I'd ever seen it. I was barely visible in the background, but you could see my hand resting on her shoulder, steady and protective. Becoming a father changed something fundamental in me. All those years of training to protect and serve suddenly had a focal point that was intensely personal. This small, helpless person would depend on me, not just for physical safety, but for guidance, example, and the kind of steady presence that I'd never had growing up. I threw myself into fatherhood with the same dedication I'd once brought to military service. I was the parent who got up for the 2 a.m. feedings, who walked the floors during teething episodes, who researched the safest car seats and child-proofed every corner of our house. When Jake took his first steps, I was there with the video camera. When he spoke his first word, Dada, I nearly cried with pride. Sarah loved watching me with our son. "You're such a natural at this," she'd say, curled up on the couch while I played blocks with Jake on the living room floor. "He's going to grow up feeling so secure." Those early years were the happiest of our marriage. Sarah thrived as a mother, bringing the same nurturing energy to raising Jake that made her such an effective teacher. Our house filled with the controlled chaos of family life, toys scattered across every room, finger paintings taped to the refrigerator, bedtime stories that stretched into elaborate adventures. I made a conscious decision to be present in ways my own father never had been. No matter how demanding work became, I was home for dinner. I coached Jake's first soccer team, taught him to ride a bike, and spent weekends building elaborate Lego cities that covered our dining room table. When Sarah's work schedule required evening parent conferences or school events, I rearranged my own commitments without question. But even during those golden years, I could sense Sarah's growing restlessness. She'd watch other families at Jake's school, the ones where fathers wore expensive suits and mothers drove luxury SUVs, and I'd see her making mental calculations. She never said anything directly, but her questions became more pointed. Did you see that Tim Patterson got promoted to regional manager? Lisa says they're looking at houses in Westfield now. Jake's friend Mason just got back from Disney World. His father took the whole family for a week. Do you ever think about going back to school? Getting an MBA maybe? You're so smart, David. You could do anything you wanted. Each comment felt like a small test that I kept failing. I tried to explain that I was happy with our life, that success couldn't be measured purely in dollars or status symbols. But Sarah came from a family where achievement was quantified by visible markers: the neighborhood you lived in, the car you drove, the college your children would attend. Her sister Janet became a particularly pointed source of comparison. Had married Robert fresh out of college, and his career in banking had provided the kind of upward trajectory that Sarah increasingly coveted. Family gatherings became exercises in subtle one-upmanship, where conversations naturally drifted toward promotions, acquisitions, and future plans that always seemed more ambitious than our own. We're thinking about the lake house again, Janet would mention casually. Robert's bonus this year should cover the down payment. The kids are both in private school now. It's expensive, but the opportunities are just so much better. We're planning a European vacation for next summer. I want the children to be exposed to different cultures while they're young. I watched Sarah absorb these updates with a fixed smile that didn't reach her eyes. She'd respond with enthusiasm about their good fortune, but I could feel her disappointment in our more modest circumstances. Growing like a weight she carried everywhere, the gap between Sarah's expectations and our reality became most apparent. When Jake started asking questions about why his friends had bigger houses or went on elaborate vacations, at 6 years old he was naturally curious about differences. He noticed in Sarah's attempts to explain why we chose to live differently often sounded forced and defensive. Some families spend their money on fancy things, she'd tell him. We spend hours on what really matters: time together and making sure you have everything you need. But I could hear the doubt in her voice, and I knew Jake could sense it too. Children are remarkably perceptive about adult emotions, and our son began to absorb the notion that our family somehow fell short of an ideal he couldn't quite articulate. The irony was that we were actually doing better financially than Sarah realized. My careful investments, combined with the money I'd saved during my military service, had grown steadily over the years. We had more in savings than most families our age, and I'd been quietly setting aside money for Jake's college education since the day he was born. But I'd never felt the need to flaunt our financial security. Having grown up with nothing, I understood the value of living below your means and maintaining a reserve for unexpected challenges. More importantly, I wanted Jake to learn that a person's worth wasn't determined by material possessions or external validation. That philosophy, which had served me well throughout my life, became the source of increasing tension in our marriage. Sarah wanted to see evidence of progress and success. I wanted to provide stability and authentic values. Neither of us was wrong, but we were growing toward incompatible definitions of what constituted a life well lived. The family portrait hanging in Sarah's parents' living room told the story of careful positioning and unspoken hierarchies. Taken at last year's Christmas gathering, it showed 3 generations arranged around the fireplace: grandparents in the center, their children and spouses flanking them, grandchildren scattered on the floor like afterthoughts. I stood on the far left, slightly apart from the main group, wearing the same navy blazer I'd owned for 5 years. Sarah was next to me, her smile bright but her posture suggesting she wished she were elsewhere. Jake sat cross-legged at our feet, his attention focused on something outside the camera's frame. The contrast with Janet and Robert's family was impossible to ignore. They occupied the prime real estate in the center right, Robert's hand resting confidently on the mantel, Janet's designer dress catching the light perfectly. Their twin daughters, Emma and Sophie, wore matching velvet dresses and practiced smiles that suggested extensive coaching and family photo protocol. Sarah's parents, Thomas and Margaret Whitman, had built their judgment systems over 40 years of marriage to a successful orthodontist. They measured worth in professional achievements, social connections, and the kind of visible success that could be discussed at country club dinners. I'd never quite fit their template for an appropriate son-in-law. David works in security, Sarah would explain when introductions were necessary. The phrase delivered with an apologetic undertone that suggested she wished she could elaborate more impressively. Corporate security, I'd clarify. Though the distinction rarely seemed to matter, family gatherings followed predictable patterns. Robert would arrive in whatever luxury sedan he was currently driving, dressed in clothes that cost more than most people's monthly mortgage payments. Janet would update everyone on their latest home renovation project or vacation planning, speaking with the casual confidence of someone who'd never had to check her bank balance. Before making a major purchase, the conversations naturally gravitated toward topics where their advantages were most apparent. Private schools versus public education, investment strategies, real estate markets, European vacation destinations. The subtle exclusion wasn't malicious. They simply lived in a world where certain assumptions about income and lifestyle were taken for granted. "We're looking at putting the girls in that new equestrian program at Riverside Academy," Janet mentioned during one particularly memorable dinner. "It's expensive, but Sarah, you should see how confident Emma's become since she started riding lessons." Sarah's response was always gracious. "That sounds wonderful. Jake's really enjoying soccer this season." "Oh, soccer's great for the exercise," Margaret would add with a kind of tone that suggested recreational sports were perfectly adequate for families with limited options. The children's interactions reflected these adult dynamics in ways that were both innocent and heartbreaking. Emma and Sophie had been trained in the art of polite superiority. They were never openly mean to Jake, but their conversations were filled with casual references to experiences he couldn't share. "Our ski instructor in Aspen said, 'I'm almost ready for intermediate slopes,'" Emma would mention while they played in the backyard. "We're getting a pool installed this summer," Sophie would add. "Maybe Jake can come swim sometime." The invitations were genuine, but they reinforced the distance between their lives and ours. Jake would come home from these gatherings full of questions about why we didn't have a bigger house or take the kinds of trips his cousins described. Sarah's answers became increasingly strained as she tried to balance honesty with the preservation of his self-esteem. The most difficult moments came when Sarah's family made well-intentioned attempts to help. Thomas would occasionally mention job opportunities he'd heard about through his network, positions that would require relocating or accepting a significant decrease in responsibility but offered higher salaries. "Margaret's brother knows someone at the regional office of that insurance company," he'd say. "They're looking for experienced people, and I bet your military background would be attractive to them." The suggestion would hang in the air while everyone waited for my response. Sarah's expression would tighten with hope and expectation. I'd politely explain that I was satisfied with my current position, and the conversation would move on with the kind of awkward transition that indicated I'd failed another unspoken test. What none of them understood was that my job provided something more valuable than a larger salary, the continuation of meaningful work that utilized skills I'd spent years developing. The security company I worked for contracted with government agencies and international corporations on projects that sometimes touched the edges of the classified world. I'd left behind. The work was intellectually challenging, and occasionally important in ways I couldn't discuss at family dinners, but that satisfaction was invisible to people who measured success by external markers. From their perspective, I was a man content with mediocrity, someone who lacked the ambition to provide his family with the lifestyle they deserved. The tragedy was that Sarah had once understood and appreciated different values. Early in our relationship, she'd told me she admired my contentment, my ability to find meaning in simple pleasures. She'd said she was tired of dating men who seemed more interested in impressing others than building something real, but years of family gatherings had gradually eroded that appreciation. Each comparison, each subtle suggestion that we were falling behind, each conversation where she had to defend our choices rather than celebrate them, created tiny fractures in her confidence about the life we'd built together. The family portrait captured that moment of disconnection perfectly. While everyone else looked toward the camera with expressions of satisfaction and belonging, I appeared to be gazing slightly to the side, as if I were already preparing to step out of the frame entirely. Jake's third-quarter report card arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, and I knew from Sarah's expression when I walked through the door that the news wasn't good. She was sitting at the kitchen table with the yellow envelope open beside her, her teaching instincts clearly at war with her maternal emotions. "We need to talk," she said without looking up from the grades spread before her. I hung my jacket on the back of the chair and sat down across from her, scanning the familiar format of elementary school progress reports. Jake's grades had slipped from B's and C's to mostly C's and D's, but it was the teacher comments that told the real story. Frequently distracted during instruction, difficulty completing assignments, appears withdrawn during group activities, would benefit from additional support at home. Mrs. Henderson had written a longer note at the bottom. "Jake is a bright child with tremendous potential, but he seems to be struggling with confidence issues this year. I'd like to schedule a conference to discuss strategies for helping him succeed." Sarah's finger traced the words as if she could somehow edit them into something more positive. "I don't understand this. He's always been such a good student. Last year Mrs. Peterson said he was reading above grade level. I studied my son's academic decline and felt the familiar weight of wondering whether I was failing as a father. The behavioral changes at school mirrored what I'd been noticing at home. Jake had become quieter, more hesitant to try new things, quicker to give up when faced with challenges. Has he said anything to you about problems at school?" I asked. "Issues with other kids?" "Nothing specific, But lately when I ask about his day, he just shrugs and says it was fine. Sarah gathered the papers into a neat stack, her movements precise and controlled. I think part of it might be the comparison thing. Some of his classmates have started talking about what their parents do for work, where they live, what kind of cars their families drive. The implication hung between us like an accusation. Jake was absorbing the same messages about worth and status that had been gradually poisoning our marriage. At 8 years old, he was developing the notion that our family somehow measured poorly against his peers. Kids that age don't usually care about those things unless adults make them important, I said carefully. Are you saying this is my fault? Sarah's voice carried the sharp edge that appeared whenever she felt defensive about her family's values. I'm saying maybe we need to think about the messages Jake's receiving about success and what matters in life. She was quiet for a long moment, and I could see her processing the validity of my concern against her growing frustration with our circumstances. As a teacher, she understood child psychology well enough to recognize the connection between Jake's behavioral changes and his environment. As my wife, she resented the suggestion that her desires for a better life were damaging our son. Mrs. Henderson wants to meet with both of us, she said finally. Thursday afternoon at 3:30. I nodded, already mentally rearranging my schedule. Parent-teacher conferences were sacred territory. Nothing at work was more important than understanding what our child needed to succeed. That evening, I found Jake in his room, supposedly working on homework, but actually staring out the window at the neighbor's new swimming pool installation. He looked small, sitting at his desk, overwhelmed by math problems that should have been manageable for a kid with his intelligence. Hey buddy, how's the homework coming? He turned toward me with the kind of defeated expression that no 8-year-old should have to wear. It's hard. I sat on the edge of his bed and looked at the worksheet basic multiplication problems that he'd completed correctly just a few weeks earlier. Want to work through a couple together? We spent 20 minutes on math that should have taken him 10, and I could feel his frustration building with each problem. He knew the answers but seemed to have lost confidence in his own abilities. Every question became an opportunity for self-doubt, rather than a chance to demonstrate knowledge. Dad, he said as I was tucking him into bed later, are we poor? But the question hit me like a physical blow. What makes you ask that, Jake? Mason's dad bought him a new bike just because he wanted one, and Emma talks about going to Disney World like it's no big deal. But when I asked if we could go to that new amusement park, Mom said we needed to think about it because money doesn't grow on trees. I sat back down on his bed, choosing my words carefully. We're not poor, buddy. We have everything we need and most of what we want. But different families make different choices about how they spend their money. Are my friends' families better than us? The innocence of the question broke my heart. At 8 years old, Jake was already internalizing the notion that worth could be measured in material terms, that our family's modest lifestyle somehow made us inferior to his more affluent classmates. Being better has nothing to do with money, Jake. It has to do with how you treat people, whether you keep your promises, and if you help others when they need it. But even as I said the words, I could see the confusion in his eyes. The messages he was receiving at school and from extended family gatherings contradicted what I was trying to teach him about values and character. After he fell asleep, I found Sarah in the living room, grading papers with the mechanical precision. That meant she was upset about something deeper than her students' performance. He asked me if we were poor. I told her. She looked up from her work, and I could see tears threatening in her eyes. God, David, what are we doing to him? He should be worried about whether his friends want to play with him, not whether we measure up to their families financially. It was the closest she'd come to acknowledging that our son was paying the price for tensions that had nothing to do with his own worth or potential. But I also heard the blame in her voice, the suggestion that if I'd been more ambitious, more willing to prioritize earning power over job satisfaction, Jake wouldn't be struggling with these issues. Thursday's conference felt like it would determine more than just our son's academic strategy. It would force us to confront whether we could find a way to support Jake without losing ourselves in the process. Sleep eluded me that night, the way it often did when unresolved tensions gathered like storm clouds on the horizon. Sarah lay beside me, breathing the deep, even rhythm of exhaustion. But I found myself staring at the ceiling, replaying the dinner conversation and Jake's questions about money and worth. At 2:30, I gave up the pretense of rest and made my way quietly to my study. The small room at the back of the house had become my sanctuary over the years, a place where military precision still governed the arrangement of books, files, and the few personal mementos I'd allowed myself to display. I opened the bottom drawer of my desk, the one that required a key I kept on my keychain, and withdrew a wooden box that had belonged to my grandfather. Inside, wrapped in blue velvet, lay the medals I'd never shown to Sarah or Jake: the Bronze Star, the Purple Heart, the Combat Action Ribbon, the Presidential Unit Citation. Each piece of medal and ribbon represented moments when ordinary people had been asked to do extraordinary things. The Bronze Star commemorated the rescue mission in Afghanistan, the night when split-second decisions had meant the difference between life and death for 4 American civilians. The Purple Heart marked the IED explosion 3 months later that had left me with permanent hearing loss in my left ear and a scar along my ribs that Sarah had never asked about. I held the Presidential Unit Citation in my palm, feeling its weight. This particular medal represented something even more significant than individual heroism and honored collective courage under impossible circumstances. Our unit had been recognized for actions during a classified operation that had prevented what intelligence analysts later described as a catastrophic terrorist event. The irony wasn't lost on me. These symbols of recognition and honor, proof of service that had mattered in ways most civilians couldn't comprehend, sat hidden in a locked drawer while I was dismissed as a man without ambition. Sarah's family saw only a security guard with limited earning potential. They had no idea that I'd once been trusted with information that could affect national security, that I'd led men in combat, that I'd made decisions under pressure that had saved lives. But the medals also represented a burden I'd chosen to carry alone. The classified nature of much of my service meant I couldn't share the details that would provide context for who I'd become. I couldn't explain why certain phone calls made me step outside, why I sometimes woke up at 3 a.m. with my heart racing, or why I'd chosen a job that prioritized meaningful work over maximum income. More complicated still was my own ambivalence about recognition. I'd seen too many veterans who'd let their service become the defining narrative of their lives, who couldn't move beyond what they'd accomplished in uniform. I'd made a conscious choice to build a civilian identity that stood on its own merits, to be valued as a husband and father rather than honored as a decorated soldier. But tonight, sitting in the quiet darkness of my study, I wondered if that choice had been wise. Jake was struggling with confidence issues, partly because he couldn't understand his father's worth. Sarah's frustration was growing because she saw only the surface of our life together. Maybe they deserved to know who I really was, I thought, about tomorrow's parent-teacher conference and the conversation that would inevitably follow. Mrs. Henderson would recommend strategies for supporting Jake's academic and emotional development. Sarah would worry about whether we were providing enough enrichment opportunities, enough exposure to the broader world, enough evidence that our family belonged among his more affluent classmates. The truth was, I could solve most of our perceived problems with a single conversation. The money I'd carefully invested over the years could buy the bigger house, the luxury vacations, the private school education that Sarah increasingly believed Jake needed. My security clearance and military experience qualified me for positions that would double or triple my current salary. One phone call to any of a dozen contacts could open doors that would satisfy our family's expectations about success and ambition. But taking that path would require abandoning principles I'd spent my entire adult life developing. I believed that character mattered more than compensation, that a person's worth couldn't be measured in quarterly earnings statements, and that Jake needed to learn these lessons before the world taught him otherwise. I returned the medals to their velvet compartments and locked the drawer. Tomorrow's conference would proceed without dramatic revelations about my past. I would support my son in whatever way Mrs. Henderson recommended, and I would continue the difficult work of being a good father and husband while maintaining my integrity. But as I finally made my way back to bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental was about to change. The distance between who I was and who my family thought I was had become unsustainable. One way or another, the truth would surface soon. The school hallway stretched before me like a gauntlet of judgment, its walls lined with colorful student artwork and motivational posters that seemed to mock my growing anxiety. I'd arrived 15 minutes early for our 3:30 appointment, partly from military habit, and partly because I needed time to prepare myself for whatever uncomfortable truths Mrs. Henderson might share about Jake's struggles. Sarah had texted at lunch to say she'd meet me there, another school obligation conflicting with her own teaching schedule. I understood the logistics that made our lives feel perpetually rushed, but I also recognized her pattern of avoiding difficult conversations by arriving just as they were scheduled to begin. The elementary school building was newer than the one I'd attended 30 years ago, all bright lighting and cheerful colors designed to inspire young minds. But walking these halls triggered memories of my own childhood struggles, the feeling of being different, the awareness that some families had advantages others lacked, the early lessons about keeping quiet when you couldn't contribute to conversations, about vacations or new purchases. I paused outside Jake's classroom to study the bulletin board displaying third-grade research projects. His report on dolphins sat in the middle row, neatly typed and illustrated with drawings that showed careful attention to detail. The content was solid. He'd clearly understood the assignment and completed it thoroughly. But compared to some of his classmates' elaborate presentations, complete with laminated photos and professional formatting, Jake's work looked modest and homemade. Other parents were beginning to arrive for their own conferences, and I found myself making the same uncomfortable comparisons that Jake probably experienced daily. The father ahead of me wore a suit that cost more than my monthly salary and spoke into his phone about closing deals and quarterly projections. The mother behind me discussed private tutoring options with another parent, their conversation filled with references to test preparation and academic enrichment programs. I checked my phone and saw a text from Sarah, running 5 minutes late. Traffic. The familiar knot of tension in my stomach tightened. These conferences worked best when both parents could present a united front. But our recent disagreements about Jake's needs and our family's priorities made unity feel increasingly elusive. Young teacher emerged from the classroom next to Jake's, shaking hands with parents whose smiles suggested good news about their child's progress. I watched them walk away with the confident bearing of people whose expectations had been met, whose concerns had been addressed with actionable solutions. Mrs. Henderson appeared in her doorway exactly at 3:30, scanning the hallway with the practiced eye of someone who'd managed countless parent conferences. She was younger than I'd expected, probably early 30s, with the kind of warm but professional demeanor that suggested she genuinely cared about her students while maintaining appropriate boundaries. "Mr. Coleman, I'm Mrs. Henderson. Please, come in." Her handshake was firm, her eye contact direct. As I followed her into the classroom, I noticed how she'd arranged the space for our meeting, 2 adult-sized chairs pulled up to her desk, Jake's portfolio open and ready for review, a small stack of assessment tools and behavioral observation notes organized nearby. "Mrs. Coleman should be here shortly," I said, settling into the chair she'd indicated. "She's coming from her own school?" "Of course. I know how challenging it can be for 2 working parents to coordinate schedules." Mrs. Henderson's tone was understanding, but I detected something else, a subtle shift in her posture, a quickening of attention that suggested she'd recognized something about me. She was studying my face with a kind of careful scrutiny that made me wonder if we'd met before. But that seemed unlikely. Jake had been in her class for 7 months, and I'd attended every school event and parent activity. We'd spoken briefly at back-to-school night and during the fall festival, but never for more than a few minutes. "Mr. Coleman," she said slowly, "I hope you don't mind me asking, but did you serve in the military?" The question caught me off guard. Most people couldn't tell just by looking at me. I'd been out of uniform for over a decade, and I'd made a conscious effort to avoid the stereotypical veteran appearance that sometimes made civilians uncomfortable. "Yes, ma'am, Marine Corps." Her expression changed completely, and before I could process what was happening, Mrs. Henderson stood and saluted, a crisp, proper salute that could only come from someone with military training. "Thank you for your service, Sergeant Major." The world stopped. The silence in the classroom felt electric, charged with the weight of recognition that neither of us had expected. Mrs. Henderson held her salute for exactly the right duration, long enough to show genuine respect, brief enough to avoid awkwardness. When she lowered her hand, her entire demeanor had shifted from polite professionalism to something approaching reverence. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "I should have realized sooner, but when you walked in, something about your bearing seemed familiar. My husband served 2 tours in Afghanistan with the Marines. He's shown me photos from his deployment, and I never forget a face when it comes to the men and women who served with him." I felt the familiar discomfort that came whenever my military service surfaced unexpectedly. "Ma'am, I think there might be some confusion. I never held the rank of Sergeant Major." "Staff Sergeant David Coleman, 3rd Reconnaissance Battalion." Her voice was quiet but certain. "October 15, 2009, Helmand Province. The rescue operation that saved for American contractors." The room seemed to contract around me. Mrs. Henderson couldn't possibly know those details, unless my husband is Corporal Marcus Henderson. "He was your radio operator during the extraction." The pieces clicked into place with stunning clarity. Marcus Henderson, the young Marine who'd provided communications support during one of the most harrowing nights of my military career. I remembered him as barely 20 years old, calm under pressure, with steady hands and the kind of reliability that made the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. "Marcus," I said softly, "how is he?" "He's doing well. Works for the fire department now. Loves it." "But Mr. Coleman, David, he talks about that night, about how you carried Dr. Chen through enemy fire, how you coordinated the evacuation when everything went wrong. He says you saved his life when that sniper opened up during the final approach to the landing zone." Memories flooded back with painful intensity. Marcus had been pinned down behind a concrete barrier when Taliban fighters had established a crossfire pattern near our extraction point. I'd provided covering fire while he moved to a better position, but the action had been instinctive, a kind of split-second decision that came from training and adrenaline rather than heroic calculation. "Marcus was a good Marine," I said. "Professional, dependable. I was glad to have him on the team." Mrs. Henderson shook her head with the gentle firmness of someone correcting a fundamental misunderstanding. "David, my husband credits you with teaching him what leadership actually means. He says you never asked anyone to do something you wouldn't do yourself, that you always put the mission and your men ahead of your own safety." She moved to her desk and pulled out a folder I hadn't noticed before. Inside was a newspaper clipping, yellowed with age, featuring a headline I remembered seeing years after the fact. "Local Marines honored for heroic rescue mission. Marcus keeps this in his office. He's tried to find you over the years. Wanted to thank you properly." When Jake started in my class and I saw the name Coleman on the roster, I wondered if there might be a connection, but I never imagined David. "Do you realize what an honor it is to have you here?" The irony was almost overwhelming. For months, I'd been sitting in school meetings and parent conferences, dismissed as a man with limited ambition and modest achievements. Meanwhile, Jake's teacher had been married to someone who understood exactly who I was and what I had accomplished during my years of service. Mrs. Henderson, I appreciate the recognition, but I'm here as Jake's father. That's the only identity that matters in this context. Of course, she said, but her eyes held a new understanding that changed everything about our dynamic. But David, this helps me understand Jake so much better. The confidence issues, the self-doubt he doesn't realize what kind of man his father is, does he? The observation hit like a physical blow. Jake was struggling with his sense of worth partly because he'd absorbed the message that his father was somehow inadequate. He'd heard the subtle criticisms, sensed Sarah's disappointment, internalized his extended family's dismissive attitude toward our lifestyle. My service record isn't something I discuss with my family, I said carefully. Much of what happened overseas remains classified, and I've always believed that civilian life should stand on its own merits. I understand the impulse, Mrs. Henderson replied. Marcus struggled with the same thing when he first came home. But David, children need heroes. They need to understand that courage and sacrifice and honor are real things, not just abstract concepts. She opened Jake's portfolio and showed me samples of his recent work essays about family traditions, drawings of important people in his life, responses to writing prompts about what makes someone special. In every piece, Jake had written about his father in terms that were loving but notably modest. My dad works hard and takes care of our family. My dad helps me with homework and comes to all my soccer games. My dad is nice to everyone and keeps his promises. The assessments were accurate but incomplete. Jake saw me as a reliable, caring father, but he had no understanding of the experiences that had shaped my character or the recognition I'd earned for actions that had mattered on a larger scale. Mrs. Henderson, I said slowly, if Marcus is willing, I'd very much like to see him again. It's been too many years. He would be thrilled. But David, there's something else you should know. She lowered her voice and leaned forward slightly. Jake talks about you constantly in class. Not about what you do for work or what kind of car you drive. He talks about your character, about how you're always fair, how you listen to him, how you make him feel safe. That's what fathers are supposed to do. Not all of them manage it. Jake may not understand your military service, but he knows exactly who you are as a person. The confidence issues aren't about you, they're about how he thinks the world sees your family. The distinction was crucial and heartbreaking. My son wasn't ashamed of me. He was ashamed of what he perceived as our family's lower status compared to his more affluent classmates. What would you recommend? I asked. Mrs. Henderson smiled with the kind of warmth that reminded me why teaching was a calling rather than just a profession. I think it's time for Jake to understand that heroes come in many forms, and that his father has always been one of them. Mrs. Henderson reached into her desk drawer and withdrew another folder. This one marked with Jake's name but containing materials I hadn't expected to see in an elementary school classroom. She spread several documents across her desk: newspaper clippings, military commendation copies, and what appeared to be printed pages from official government websites. I hope you don't mind, she said, but after I made the connection between you and Marcus, I did some research. Most of your service record is classified, of course, but there are public records of certain commendations and unit citations. She pointed to a Department of Defense press release dated November 2009. The headline read, Marines honored for heroic actions in Afghanistan. Below it was a photograph. I barely remembered myself and 11 other Marines standing at attention during an awards ceremony at Camp Lejeune. According to this report, your unit was credited with preventing what military analysts described as a significant terrorist operation. The details are limited, but the commendations speak for themselves. She traced her finger along the text. Bronze Star for heroic achievement. Purple Heart for wounds received in combat. Presidential Unit. Citation for extraordinary heroism. The formal language of military recognition felt strange in the context of an elementary school conference. These were accomplishments I'd spent years learning to carry quietly, privately, without the need for external validation. There's more, Mrs. Henderson continued, opening another clipping. This one's from the Marine Corps Times. About 6 months after your discharge. It mentions your transition to civilian work and quotes a commanding officer, General Patricia Williams, saying that you were one of the finest Marines I've had the privilege to serve with. I remembered General Williams, a no-nonsense officer, who'd demanded excellence and rarely offered praise. Her endorsement carried weight that extended far beyond military circles. Mrs. Henderson, I appreciate you taking the time to research this, but I'm not sure how it relates to Jake's academic progress. It relates because your son is absorbing messages about his family's worth that are fundamentally incorrect. She leaned back in her chair and studied me with the analytical gaze of someone trained to understand child development. Jake's confidence issues aren't occurring in a vacuum. Children are remarkably perceptive about adult emotions and family dynamics. She opened Jake's recent writing samples again, this time focusing on subtle details I'd missed during my first review. In his essay about family traditions, Jake had written, "My mom says we do things differently than other families because we think about money more carefully." In a piece about future goals, he'd noted, "I want to have a job that makes enough money so my kids won't have to worry." The implications were heartbreaking. At 8 years old, Jake was already internalizing financial anxiety and developing the notion that our family's careful budgeting was evidence of inadequacy rather than responsibility. Has he mentioned specific incidents at school? I asked. Comments from other children? Nothing overt. Children this age rarely engage in direct confrontation about family circumstances. But there have been subtle patterns: Jake declining invitations to birthday parties at expensive venues, avoiding conversations about vacation plans, appearing uncomfortable when classmates discuss their parents' careers. Mrs. Henderson pulled out her behavioral observation notes from the past month. The entries painted a picture of a child gradually withdrawing from social interactions that might highlight differences between his family and his peers. The irony, she continued, is that Jake talks about you with genuine pride and affection. He's told the class about your camping trips, the birdhouse you built together, how you coached his soccer team, even though you'd never played the sport yourself. He clearly adores you, but he's also absorbed the message that these qualities aren't valuable in the broader world. When other children mention their father's important jobs or impressive achievements, Jake becomes quiet and withdrawn. She showed me a drawing Jake had completed the previous week as part of a lesson about community helpers. While his classmates had drawn police officers, firefighters, and doctors in action poses, Jake had drawn a simple figure labeled "My Dad" sitting behind a desk with the caption, "He helps keep people safe." The description was accurate but modest, reflecting Jake's limited understanding of what my work actually entailed. He knew I worked in security but had no context for the specialized knowledge, clearance requirements, or strategic importance of the contracts my company handled. Mrs. Henderson, even if I were comfortable sharing details about my military service, much of it remains classified. I can't exactly tell my 8-year-old son about covert operations or combat missions. Of course not. But there are ways to help children understand service and sacrifice without compromising security. Marcus has found age-appropriate ways to discuss his deployment with our own children. They understand that their father served his country, that he helped protect people, and that his military experience taught him values they should be proud of. She gathered the documents back into their folder and looked at me directly. "David, I've been teaching for 8 years. I've seen children from every kind of background: wealthy families, struggling families, single parents, military families, families dealing with deployment and separation. The children who thrive are the ones who understand their family's story and feel proud of their place in it." What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting that Jake deserves to know who his father really is. Not the classified details, but the character that those experiences revealed and developed. He needs to understand that service comes in many forms, that heroism isn't always visible, and that his family's values are something to celebrate rather than apologize for. Mrs. Henderson stood and moved to the window, where she could see the playground where Jake spent his recesses. "There's something else you should know. Next month, we're having a Veterans Day assembly. I've been looking for someone to speak to the students about military service, someone who could help them understand what sacrifice and dedication really mean." The invitation hung in the air between us like a challenge. For years, I'd avoided public recognition of my military service, preferring the anonymity of civilian life. But sitting in that classroom, surrounded by evidence of my son's growing self-doubt, I began to understand that my silence might be doing more harm than good. Would Jake know in advance that I was speaking? Only if you wanted him to. But David, imagine how he'd feel, sitting in that auditorium with his classmates, watching his father receive the recognition and respect he deserves. Imagine how it might change his understanding of who he is and what his family represents. The prospect was both terrifying and tempting. Part of me wanted to maintain the quiet dignity I'd cultivated over the years, but another part, the father who watched his son struggle with confidence, who saw him withdraw from social situations because he felt somehow lesser, understood that the time for silence might be ending. Sarah arrived 20 minutes into our conference, apologizing breathlessly for the traffic delay, but stopped short when she noticed the unusual energy in the room. Mrs. Henderson was showing me Jake's latest art project, a hand-drawn picture of our family, where I was depicted wearing what appeared to be a military uniform, complete with medals and ribbons that Jake had colored in bright, careful detail. I asked the children to draw their families as superheroes, Mrs. Henderson explained to Sarah. Jake's interpretation was particularly interesting. Sarah studied the drawing with confusion. "I don't understand. David's never told Jake about—" She stopped herself, glancing between Mrs. Henderson and me with a sudden realization that something significant had been discussed in her absence. "Mrs. Coleman," Mrs. Henderson said gently, "I hope you don't mind, but I've been sharing some information about your husband's military service with Jake. My husband served with David in Afghanistan, and I thought it was important for Jake to understand his father's background." The color drained from Sarah's face. "Served with him? What do you mean served with him?" I watched my wife process the implications of Mrs. Henderson's words, seeing the moment when years of assumptions about my military career collided with evidence that suggested a completely different reality. Perhaps we should focus on Jake's academic progress, I said, trying to redirect the conversation away from details I still wasn't ready to share publicly, but Mrs. Henderson had clearly made a decision about what Jake needed to know. I've been explaining to Jake that his father is a genuine American hero, that he served his country with distinction and saved lives during his deployment overseas. Sarah's eyes widened. Saved lives? David, what is she talking about? The moment I'd been avoiding for years had arrived with the force of an avalanche. There was no graceful way to deflect or minimize what Mrs. Henderson had already shared. My wife deserved to know the truth, and my son deserved to understand who his father really was. I was involved in a rescue operation in Afghanistan, I said simply. Mrs. Henderson's husband was part of my unit. A rescue operation where you were awarded the Bronze Star and Purple Heart. Mrs. Henderson added, clearly determined to ensure that Jake's story was told completely. Sarah sank into her chair as if her legs had suddenly stopped supporting her. Wait, Bronze Star, Purple Heart? David, why didn't you ever tell me any of this? The question carried years of frustration and hurt, but also a dawning understanding that the man she'd been married to for 15 years was someone she'd never really known. Much of my service record is classified, I explained, and I've always believed that civilian life should stand on its own merits. But Jake, Sarah's voice broke slightly. Jake thinks you work a desk job. He thinks you're just a security guard. I am just a security guard, I said. That's who I am now. Mrs. Henderson intervened with the firm authority of someone accustomed to managing difficult conversations. Mr. Coleman, with your permission, I'd like to share what I've already told Jake about his father's service. I think it would help both of you understand how dramatically this information has affected him. She pulled out a folder containing Jake's work from the past week assignments, completed after our initial conversation about my military background. The change in his writing was immediately apparent. Where his previous essays had been tentative and self-deprecating, these new pieces showed confidence and pride. My dad served in the Marines and helped save people. He'd written in response to a prompt about personal heroes. He was brave and protected other soldiers. Mrs. Henderson says, he has medals for being courageous. Another assignment showed even more dramatic evidence of his transformed self-perception. Some kids' dads have fancy jobs and make lots of money. My dad was a Marine who helped keep America safe. I think that's more important than any job, Sarah. Read Jake's new writing with tears streaming down her face. He's been ashamed of us, she whispered. All this time, he's been ashamed of our family because he thought we weren't successful enough. He was never ashamed of you, Mrs. Henderson corrected gently. He was confused about his family's place in the world. But look at this drawing he made yesterday. She showed us a picture Jake had drawn of himself standing next to a figure in military uniform. The caption read, I am proud to be my hero, Dad's son. The transformation was remarkable and heartbreaking. In less than a week, Jake had moved from self-doubt to genuine pride, simply by learning that his father's quiet strength and steady character had roots in experiences that the broader world recognized as significant. There's more, Mrs. Henderson continued. Jake's behavior in class has changed completely. He's participating in discussions again, volunteering for leadership roles, and his academic work has returned to the level we saw at the beginning of the year. She showed us his latest math homework completed accurately and independently, with neat handwriting and obvious attention to detail. The difference from his struggling work of the previous month was startling. Understanding his father's background has given Jake a framework for understanding his own worth, Mrs. Henderson explained. He stopped comparing your family to others and started taking pride in who he is. Sarah wiped her eyes and looked at me with an expression I couldn't entirely read. David, I need to understand something. If you earned these commendations, if you served with this kind of distinction, why have you been willing to let everyone think you're just what? I asked quietly. Just ordinary. Just someone without ambition or significant achievements. The question hung between us, carrying 15 years of misunderstandings and missed opportunities for connection. I thought about how to answer honestly, without sounding defensive or critical of the values that had driven her frustration with our life. I've never been just ordinary, Sarah. I've been exactly who I wanted to be: a good husband, a devoted father, and someone who serves others in whatever capacity I can. The medals don't change that, and they don't make me more valuable than I was yesterday. Double quotes. Mrs. Henderson smiled at my response. But they do help Jake understand that his father's character was forged in circumstances that required real courage. And that makes all the difference in how he sees himself and his family. The transformation in Jake's confidence became apparent to other parents within days of our conference with Mrs. Henderson. At soccer practice that Saturday, I noticed several mothers looking at me with expressions that suggested they'd heard something that had changed their perception of our family's place in the community hierarchy. Linda Patterson, whose husband managed a regional bank branch, approached me during halftime with the kind of careful smile that indicated she was navigating unfamiliar social territory. David, I hope you don't mind me mentioning this, But Mrs. Henderson shared some information about your military service at yesterday's faculty meeting. I had no idea about your background. The comment confirmed what I'd suspected, that Mrs. Henderson had made a deliberate decision to ensure that Jake's classmates' parents understood the full context of our family's story. It was a violation of my privacy, but I could understand her motivation. I don't usually discuss my service record, I said diplomatically. Of course not. But David, Tim, and I had coffee with the Hendersons last week, and Marcus told us about Afghanistan, about the rescue mission. He says you saved his life. Linda's tone carried a mixture of respect and embarrassment that suggested she was remembering previous conversations where my career had been discussed with subtle condescension. Marcus was a good Marine. We looked out for each other. He says you carried a wounded civilian through enemy fire for 3 hours. That you coordinated an evacuation under impossible circumstances. The details were becoming more dramatic with each retelling, but I understood the tendency of military stories to grow in significance over time. What mattered was that Jake's social environment was shifting in ways that would support his newfound confidence. By Monday morning, the change was unmistakable. Jake walked into school with his shoulders back and his head high, greeting classmates with the kind of easy confidence I hadn't seen from him in months. When I picked him up that afternoon, he was practically vibrating with excitement. "Dad, guess what happened at lunch today?" "Tell me." Mason was bragging about his dad's new car, and Emma was talking about their trip to Europe this summer. "But then Tommy asked me what you do for work, and I got to tell everyone about how you were a Marine and saved people in Afghanistan." The pride in his voice was unmistakable, but I also heard something that concerned me. The notion that my military service was valuable primarily because it could compete with other families' markers of success. "Jake, what I did in the Marines was important, but it doesn't make me better than Mason's dad or Emma's dad. Different people serve in different ways." "I know, Dad, but Mrs. Henderson says that protecting people and serving your country is one of the most important jobs anyone can have." We talked about service and sacrifice during our drive home, and I tried to help Jake understand that heroism came in many forms: teachers who dedicated their lives to education, doctors who saved lives every day, parents who worked multiple jobs to provide for their families. Military service was honorable, but it wasn't inherently superior to other forms of contribution. That evening, Sarah showed me a newsletter that had arrived from Jake's school. The lead story featured an announcement about the upcoming Veterans Day assembly, with a paragraph that made my stomach clench. "We are honored to announce that Staff Sergeant David Coleman, USMC Ret, will be our featured speaker for this year's Veterans Day program. Sergeant Coleman served with distinction in Afghanistan and was awarded the Bronze Star for heroic actions during combat operations. We look forward to learning about his experiences and honoring his service to our country." I stared at the newsletter, trying to process how my private conversation with Mrs. Henderson had evolved into a public speaking engagement I'd never explicitly agreed to. "David," Sarah said quietly, "did you know about this? Mrs. Henderson mentioned the possibility during our conference." I didn't realize she'd already made the announcement. Sarah sat down beside me on the couch, studying my expression with the kind of careful attention that suggested she was trying to understand something fundamental about the man she'd married. "Are you angry about this? About her sharing your story?" I considered the question carefully. Part of me was frustrated by the loss of privacy, the way my military service was being transformed into a public narrative I'd never wanted to create. But another part of me understood that Mrs. Henderson's actions were motivated by genuine concern for Jake's welfare. "I'm concerned about the expectations this creates," I said finally. "People are going to want stories about combat and heroism. They're going to expect someone who looks and acts like their idea of a decorated veteran, and you don't think you fit that image. I think I'm a man who did his job under difficult circumstances and came home to build a quiet life with his family. The medals and commendations were recognition for specific actions, but they don't define who I am 15 years later." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, processing the implications of what I'd said. "David, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest with me, okay? If you hadn't been bound by classification requirements, if you could have told me about your service from the beginning, would our marriage have been different?" The question cut to the heart of everything that had been wrong between us for years. I thought about the nights when Sarah had expressed frustration with my lack of ambition, the family gatherings where I'd been dismissed as someone without significant achievements, the gradual erosion of her respect for the life we'd built together. "I don't know," I said honestly, "but I think we might have understood each other better." I found Sarah in our bedroom that evening, sitting on the floor with a cardboard box I hadn't seen in years spread open before her. The contents were scattered across the carpet like archaeological evidence of a relationship I'd almost forgotten: letters, photographs, and mementos from our early years together. "I've been looking for something," she said without glancing up. "I knew I'd kept your letters from Afghanistan, but I couldn't remember where I'd put them." She held up a bundle of envelopes, each one addressed in my careful handwriting to Mrs. Sarah Coleman at our first apartment. The paper had yellowed slightly with age, and the overseas postmarks were smudged but still legible. "I haven't read These and probably 10 years, she continued, her voice carrying a mixture of anticipation and apprehension. I'm not even sure I remember what you wrote. I sat down on the edge of the bed, watching as she selected one letter and carefully opened the envelope. Her expression as she read was difficult to interpret: surprise, recognition, and something that looked like grief. Listen to this, she said, clearing her throat slightly. This is from December 2009, about 2 months after that rescue mission Mrs. Henderson mentioned. She read aloud, in a voice that grew increasingly emotional. My dearest Sarah, I can't tell you much about what happened last week, but I can tell you that it reminded me why I'm here and what I'm fighting for. Every day in this place I think about the life we're going to build together when I come home. Not a perfect life or an easy life, but a life filled with the kind of love and stability I never had growing up. I dream about ordinary moments: Saturday morning breakfast, watching you grade papers at the kitchen table, teaching our future children to ride bicycles. The men I serve with talk about fancy cars and big houses, but I just want to wake up next to you every morning and know that we're building something real. Sarah's voice broke slightly as she continued. I know the money isn't great, and the future seems uncertain sometimes, but I promise you that everything I'm learning here about loyalty, sacrifice, and what really matters I'm going to bring home to our marriage. I want to be the kind of husband who deserves a woman like you, someone who chooses love over everything else the world says should matter. She folded the letter carefully and looked at me with tears streaming down her face. David, I don't remember. This man, the man who wrote these letters, where did he go? The question hit me harder than I'd expected. He's still here, Sarah. He's been here the whole time. But I stopped seeing him. She picked up another letter, scanning its contents. God, David, these are beautiful. They're full of hope and dreams and plans for our future. When did I stop appreciating what we had? I thought about the gradual erosion of satisfaction that had characterized our marriage, the slow shift from gratitude for what we'd built to frustration about what we hadn't achieved. I think it happened gradually, I said. The phone call came on Sunday morning while Sarah and I were making pancakes with Jake. The caller ID showed Janet's number, which was unusual. My sister-in-law typically communicated through Sarah, and never on weekends before noon. David, Janet's voice carried an unfamiliar note of uncertainty. I hope I'm not calling at a bad time, but Robert and I were wondering if we could come over this afternoon. There's something we'd like to discuss with you and Sarah. I glanced at Sarah, who was listening with obvious curiosity. Of course. Is everything all right? Everything's fine. We heard about your military service, and we feel like we owe you a conversation. After I hung up, Sarah explained that her sister had called the night before, having learned about my background through the network of parents connected to Jake's school. Apparently, Marcus Henderson had attended a neighborhood barbecue where several families from our area had gathered, and my story had become a topic of significant discussion. Janet sounded different, Sarah said as she flipped pancakes with unusual focus. Embarrassed, maybe, or ashamed. Jake looked up from his systematic arrangement of blueberries on his pancake. Are Aunt Janet and Uncle Robert coming to hear about Dad's medals? The innocent question highlighted how dramatically our family narrative had shifted in just a few weeks. Jake now spoke about my military service with casual pride, as if it had always been a known part of our family's identity. Janet and Robert arrived that afternoon, carrying an expensive bottle of wine and wearing expressions that suggested they were navigating unfamiliar emotional territory. Robert's typical confidence seemed muted, and Janet's usual social ease had been replaced by something approaching nervousness. David, Robert said as he shook my hand, I understand congratulations are in order. We had no idea about your service record. It's not something I typically discuss, I replied, leading them into the living room where Sarah had arranged coffee, and the kind of formal seating that suggested this would be a significant conversation. Janet sat on the edge of the couch, her posture unnaturally straight. David, we owe you an apology. Robert and I have been doing some research since we learned about your military background, and we realized that our comments over the years have been, she paused, searching for the right word, inappropriate. What kind of research? Asked. Robert pulled out his phone and showed us several articles he'd apparently bookmarked. The rescue mission you were involved in made national news, though your name wasn't mentioned in most of the coverage. But the military databases that are publicly accessible show your commendations, and there are veteran advocacy websites that discuss the significance of certain medals. He scrolled through what appeared to be a detailed investigation into my service record. David, the Bronze Star you received according to these sources, it's awarded for heroic or meritorious achievement in combat. The citation mentions extraordinary courage under fire and actions that directly resulted in saving multiple American lives. Janet leaned forward, her expression intense. We also found information about the Presidential Unit Citation your battalion received. The article says it's one of the highest honors that can be awarded to a military unit, reserved for extraordinary heroism in action against an armed enemy. I felt uncomfortable with the detailed scrutiny of my service record, but I understood their need to comprehend the full scope of what they'd been dismissing for years. The point is, Robert continued, we've been complete idiots. We've been treating you like someone without significant achievements while you were quietly carrying the kind of recognition that most people only read about in history books. Sarah reached over and took my hand. They're not the only ones who didn't understand. Janet's eyes filled with tears. David, I keep thinking about all the times we made comments about your career, about your lack of ambition. God, I'm so ashamed. You couldn't have known, I said simply. I never talked about my military service. But that's exactly the point, Robert replied. A decent person doesn't need to know someone's resume to treat them with respect. We should have valued you for who you are as a person, as Sarah's husband and Jake's father. He stood up and walked to the window, his typical composure clearly shaken. I've been thinking about this all week. Here I am, proud of closing bank deals and earning promotions, while you were overseas, saving lives and serving your country. The comparison is humbling, to say the least. Robert, your work is important too. Different people serve in different ways. That's generous of you to say, but let's be honest. I've spent my career helping wealthy people get wealthier. You've spent yours protecting people and making sacrifices that I can't even imagine. Janet had been listening to this exchange with growing emotion. David, there's something else we need to address. Emma and Sophie have been talking about Jake differently since they learned about your military service. They're suddenly interested in what he has to say, asking questions about what it's like to have a hero for a father. Jake's not defined by my military service, I said firmly. He's a good kid because of who he is, not because of what I did 15 years ago. Of course, Janet agreed quickly. But the point is, our children absorbed our attitudes about your family. They learned to see Jake as somehow less fortunate, less important, because that's how we were treating you. Sarah's grip on my hand tightened. Janet, we've all made mistakes. Maybe, but ours were inexcusable. We had 15 years to get to know David as a person, to understand his character and values. Instead, we judged him based on superficial markers of success. Robert returned to his seat and looked at me directly. David, I want to ask you something, and please be honest. Has our treatment of you and your family made your life more difficult? Has it affected your marriage or Jake's sense of self-worth? The question required careful consideration. These were Sarah's family members, people she loved despite their flaws. But they deserved honesty about the impact their attitudes had created. I think Jake has struggled with confidence because he absorbed the message that our family somehow measured poorly against yours, I said carefully. And yes, the constant suggestions that I lacked ambition or was settling for mediocrity created tension in my marriage. Robert nodded grimly. That's what I was afraid of. David, I don't know how to undo years of damage, but I want you to know that you have our complete respect and admiration moving forward. What we'd really like, Janet added, is the chance to build a better relationship with your family, to show Jake and Saran youth that we understand how wrong we've been. The conversation continued for another hour, with Janet and Robert asking detailed questions about my military service and expressing genuine interest in understanding the experiences that had shaped my character. For the first time in 15 years, I felt like they were seeing me as a complete person rather than a disappointing reflection of their expectations. As they prepared to leave, Robert handed me a small wrapped package. This isn't much, but we wanted to give you something that acknowledged what you've done for our country. Inside was a military challenge, coin a bronze medallion commemorating Marine Corps service in Afghanistan. It was a thoughtful gift that showed they'd taken time to understand the significance of military traditions. Thank you, I said, genuinely moved by the gesture. This means more than you know. Janet hugged Sarah goodbye, then turned to me with tears in her eyes. David, we'll never be able to fully apologize for the years we wasted not appreciating who you really are. But I hope you'll give us the chance to do better. After they left, Sarah and I sat in our living room processing the emotional weight of the conversation. Jake, who had listened quietly from the stairs, came down and curled up between us on the couch. Dad, he said thoughtfully, I'm glad they know about your medals now, but I was already proud of you before they found out. The simple honesty of his statement reminded me that while external recognition could be satisfying, the most important validation had always come from the people who loved me for who I was rather than what I'd accomplished. The weeks following Janet and Robert's visit brought a subtle but profound shift in our family's rhythm. Sarah had taken down the old family portrait from the hallway and replaced it with a new photograph, one taken at Jake's recent soccer game, where all three of us were laughing at something he'd said, our faces relaxed and genuinely happy. I like this one better, Jake announced one morning, pausing to study the picture on his way to the kitchen. We look like we're having fun. He was right. The new photograph captured something the formal family portraits had always missed: easy affection and natural joy that characterized our best moments together. We looked like people who genuinely enjoyed each other's company, rather than a family posing for appearances. Sarah and I had been having conversations that we should have had years earlier, working through the misunderstandings and missed connections that had created distance between us. The process wasn't always comfortable. There were moments when old resentments surfaced, when we had to confront painful truths about how we'd failed each other. I need you to understand something, Sarah said one evening as we walked through our neighborhood after dinner. When I pushed you about money and career advancement, it wasn't because I thought you were lazy or unambitious. I was scared. Scared. Of what? Scared that I'd made the wrong choice. Scared that I was holding you back from achieving something greater. Scared that you'd eventually resent me for being content with a smaller life than you deserved. The admission surprised me. I'd always interpreted her frustration as disappointment in what I'd achieved, not concern about what I might be sacrificing. Sarah, I've never felt held back by our marriage. If anything, you and Jake gave me something to build toward that felt more meaningful than any career advancement. But I didn't know that. You're so self-contained, so private about your feelings. I started interpreting your contentment as resignation, your satisfaction as settling for less than you wanted. We talked about communication patterns that had developed over years of marriage, my tendency to process emotions internally, her inclination to seek external validation for our choices. Neither approach was wrong, but they'd created a dynamic where we were constantly misreading each other's intentions. I want to try something different, Sarah said as we paused at the small park where Jake had learned to ride his bicycle. I want us to talk about our goals and dreams the way we used to in those letters you wrote from Afghanistan. Not about what we think we should want, but about what actually makes us happy. We spent that evening making lists, hopes for Jake's future, plans for our marriage, ideas about how we wanted to spend the next phase of our lives. The conversation revealed how much we'd lost sight of shared values while focusing on external measures of success. I want Jake to grow up confident and kind, Sarah wrote. I want him to understand that his worth isn't determined by what he owns or achieves, but by how he treats people and whether he contributes something positive to the world. I want us to travel together as a family. I added, not exotic vacations or expensive trips, but road trips where we explore new places and create memories together. I want to feel proud of our life again, Sarah continued. Not defensive about our choices, but genuinely satisfied with what we've built. The exercise reminded us that our fundamental values had never been incompatible. We'd simply lost track of them while trying to meet expectations that didn't align with who we really were. Jake's transformation continued to amaze both of us. His confidence had returned fully, but more importantly, he'd developed a clearer sense of his own identity. He still enjoyed hearing stories about my military service, but he'd also begun taking pride in his own accomplishments and character traits. Mrs. Henderson says I'm a good leader because I listen to other people's ideas and try to include everyone, he told us after being selected as line leader for the week. She says leadership isn't about being the loudest or strongest person. That's absolutely right, I replied. The best leaders I served with were the ones who cared more about their team's success than their own recognition. Did you learn that in the Marines? I learned it from watching good leaders and bad leaders. The Marines taught me that authority has to be earned through respect, not just rank. These conversations about leadership and character felt more natural now that Jake understood the context of my military experience. But I was careful to emphasize that the lessons I'd learned in the service applied to civilian life as well, that integrity, teamwork, and service to others were valuable regardless of your profession. Sarah had also begun integrating my military background into our family's narrative in thoughtful ways. She'd started mentioning my service when appropriate during social conversations, not as a way to elevate our status, but as part of honestly representing who we were as a family. David served in the Marines before we met, she'd say when people asked about our background. His experience overseas really shaped his perspective on what matters in life. The shift was subtle but significant. Instead of apologizing for our modest lifestyle or making excuses for our choices, Sarah had begun presenting our family's story with confidence and pride. I realized something. She told me one night as we were getting ready for bed. I'd been trying to defend our life instead of celebrating it. But there's nothing to defend. We have a good marriage, a wonderful son, and a life built on values that actually matter. What changed your perspective? Reading your letters reminded me of who we were when we were at our best. And seeing Jake's confidence return helped me understand that children absorb their parents' attitudes about their own worth. She was wearing the locket I'd given her before my deployment, and she touched it unconsciously as she spoke. I want Jake to grow up proud of his family, not apologetic about it. I want him to understand that success can be measured in many different ways. The upcoming Veterans Day assembly had become a source of anticipation rather than anxiety for all of us. Jake talked about it constantly, excited for his classmates to hear his father speak. Sarah had volunteered to help with decorations and refreshments, eager to support the event that would publicly acknowledge my service. Are you nervous about speaking? She asked as we discussed my presentation. A little, I admitted, but mostly I'm looking forward to it. For years, I've kept my military experience separate from my civilian life. It feels good to integrate those parts of who I am. What will you tell them? I want to talk about service in the broadest sense, about how we all have opportunities to serve others, whether that's in the military, in schools, in our communities, or in our families. I want the children to understand that heroism comes in many forms. Sarah smiled and kissed my cheek. That's perfect. That's exactly what they need to hear. The guest speaker badge felt unexpectedly heavy in my hand as I stood outside the elementary school auditorium on Veterans Day morning. Through the doors, I could hear the excited chatter of children settling into their seats, teachers managing the controlled chaos of a school-wide assembly, and the gentle murmur of parents who had arrived early to find good viewing spots. Sarah squeezed my arm reassuringly. "You're going to be wonderful," she whispered. "Just speak from your heart." Jake had left us at the auditorium entrance, practically bouncing with excitement as he joined his classmates. I'd watched him point toward where we were standing and tell his friends, "That's my dad. He's the guest speaker." The pride in his voice still echoed in my ears. Mrs. Henderson appeared at my side, wearing a professional smile that didn't quite hide her own nervousness about the event she'd orchestrated. "David, are you ready? The children are very excited to hear from you." I nodded, adjusting the tie I'd chosen carefully that morning, navy blue with small American flags, a gift from Jake that he'd picked out specifically for this occasion. "I'm ready." "One more thing," she said, lowering her voice. "I wanted you to know that Marcus is here. He drove over from the fire station this morning. He's sitting in the back row with some of his colleagues who also wanted to hear you speak." The knowledge that my former radio operator was in the audience added another layer of significance to the moment. Marcus had been there during the events I'd be discussing, and his presence felt like a bridge between my military service and my civilian life. As we entered the auditorium, I was struck by the sea of young faces looking up at the stage with expressions of anticipation and curiosity. These children represented the future that my military service had been designed to protect, and speaking to them felt like completing a circle that had been 15 years in the making. Principal Martinez introduced me with remarks that felt both accurate and overwhelming. She spoke about sacrifice and service, about the importance of remembering those who had answered their country's call, and about the honor of having a genuine American hero in their school community. When I stepped up to the microphone, the auditorium fell silent with the kind of focused attention that teachers dream about but rarely achieve. I could see Jake in the third row, sitting up straight with a smile that threatened to split his face in half. "Good morning," I began, my voice carrying clearly through the sound system. "Thank you for inviting me to speak with you today. My name is David Coleman, and I had the privilege of serving in the United States Marine Corps for 15 years. I paused, looking out at the audience of children, parents, and teachers who were giving me their complete attention. "But before I tell you about my military service, I want you to know that my most important job has nothing to do with the Marines. My most important job is being Jake Coleman's father." Jake's classmates turned to look at him, and I could see his chest swell with pride. But I also saw something else in his expression, a deeper understanding that his father's identity wasn't defined solely by military achievements, but by the full scope of who he was as a person. Today is Veterans Day, which means we're here to honor people who served in our country's military. But I want to talk with you about something bigger than just military service. I want to talk about what it means to serve others. I shared stories that I'd carefully chosen for their age-appropriate lessons about courage, teamwork, and sacrifice. I spoke about the importance of looking out for your teammates, about making difficult decisions under pressure, and about the satisfaction that comes from helping others. Some of you might think that heroes are people who do extraordinary things in faraway places, I continued. But the truth is, heroes are all around us every day. Your teachers serve by dedicating their lives to helping you learn and grow. Your parents serve by working hard to provide for your families. Police officers, firefighters, doctors, and nurses serve by protecting and caring for people in their communities. I could see parents throughout the auditorium nodding with approval, and several teachers had tears in their eyes as they recognized their profession being honored alongside military service. The most important thing I learned during my time in the Marines is that service isn't about wearing a uniform or earning medals. Service is about choosing to help others, even when it's difficult or inconvenient or scary. Service is about being reliable, keeping your promises, and standing up for what's right. I told them about the rescue mission in Afghanistan, but I focused on the teamwork and communication rather than the danger and violence. I explained how every person in our unit had a specific job to do, and how success depended on everyone doing their part with excellence and dedication. That night in Afghanistan, we saved 4 American civilians who were counting on us to bring them home safely. But we weren't successful because we were stronger or braver than other people. We were successful because we had trained together, because we trusted each other, and because we were willing to put other people's welfare ahead of our own comfort. I could see Jake listening with rapt attention, finally understanding the context of stories he'd been hearing for weeks. But more importantly, I could see him connecting these experiences to lessons about character and responsibility that would serve him throughout his life. The medals and commendations I received were recognition for specific actions, but they don't make me more valuable than anyone else in this room. What makes any of us valuable is how we treat other people, whether we keep our commitments, and if we're willing to help when someone needs us. As I concluded my remarks, I looked directly at Jake. I'm proud of my military service, but I'm even more proud to be part of this community. I'm proud to be married to a teacher who shapes young minds every day. I'm proud to be the father of a son who shows kindness to his classmates and respect for his teachers. I'm proud to live in a place where people support each other and work together to build something good." The applause was sustained and heartfelt, but what mattered most to me was the expression on Jake's face. He looked proud, but also thoughtful, as if he was processing new understanding about service, sacrifice, and what it meant to be part of something larger than yourself. After the assembly, Marcus found me in the hallway, and we embraced with the easy familiarity of men who had shared experiences that bonded them permanently. We talked for 20 minutes about our families, our careers, and our memories of that night in Afghanistan 15 years ago. "David," he said as we prepared to part ways, "I've thought about you often over the years. I'm glad to see that you've built such a good life for yourself." "You too, Marcus. Sarah tells me your wife thinks very highly of you. She's the one who recognized you, you know? I showed her photos from our deployment years ago, and she never forgot your face. She says it's because you have the kind of presence that people remember." As Marcus left with his fire department colleagues, Sarah and Jake joined me in the hallway. Jake immediately launched into an excited recap of my presentation, telling me which parts his friends had found most interesting and which teachers had commented on my remarks. "Dad," he said as we walked toward our car, "I understand something now that I didn't before." "What's that, buddy?" "Being a hero isn't about having medals or being famous. It's about caring about other people and being willing to help them." Sarah looked at me over Jake's head with an expression that combined pride, love, and deep satisfaction. "That's exactly right," she said. "That's exactly what your father has been trying to teach you all along." As we drove home from the school, I reflected on how dramatically our family's story had changed in just a few weeks. The same people, the same relationships, the same basic circumstances, but a completely different understanding of our worth and place in the world. That evening, as I tucked Jake into bed, he asked me one final question about my military service. "Dad, do you miss being in the Marines?" I considered the question carefully. I miss some things about it: the clear sense of mission, the brotherhood with other Marines, the feeling that every day had important purpose. But Jake, I wouldn't trade the life I have now for anything. Being your father and Sarah's husband is the most important mission I've ever had. He smiled and hugged me goodnight, and as I turned off his bedroom light, I realized that the long journey from that dinner table humiliation to this moment of family unity had taught me something crucial about identity and worth. Recognition from others could be satisfying, but it couldn't provide the deep satisfaction that came from living according to your own values. External validation might boost confidence temporarily, but lasting self-respect had to come from the knowledge that you were contributing something meaningful to the world and the people you loved. I found Sarah in our living room, grading papers, with the comfortable efficiency of someone who had found her calling. She looked up as I entered and smiled the same warm, genuine smile that had captured my attention at that Veterans Day barbecue 23 years earlier. "How does it feel," she asked, "to finally have everyone know who you really are?" I sat down beside her and considered the question. "It feels good to have the different parts of my life integrated. But Sarah, the most important people always knew who I really was. You and Jake, you've seen my character every day for years. The military service just provided context for how that character was developed." She set aside her papers and curled up next to me on the couch. "I'm sorry it took me so long to remember that. We both lost sight of what mattered for a while, but we found our way back." Outside our window, the neighborhood was settling into the quiet rhythm of a weeknight evening. Children were finishing homework, families were sharing dinner conversations, and the ordinary business of building good lives was continuing in houses up and down our street. I thought about the guest speaker badge in my jacket pocket, the applause from this morning's assembly, and the recognition that had finally surfaced after years of privacy. But what filled me with the deepest satisfaction was this moment sitting with my wife in our comfortable home, knowing that our son was sleeping peacefully upstairs, confident that we had built something real and lasting together. The medals in my locked drawer represented important chapters in my life, but they didn't define my worth any more than the opinions of people who had once dismissed my choices. What defined my worth was the daily commitment to being a good husband, a devoted father, and a person who contributed positively to his community. Tomorrow, Jake would go to school with renewed confidence in his family's story. Sarah would continue shaping young minds with the passion that made her an exceptional teacher. I would return to work that utilized my skills in service of something meaningful. We would continue building a life that reflected our values rather than other people's expectations, and that felt like the greatest victory of all.